So tonight's topic, a crash course in prophets and prophecy. Okay. They tell the story of a medieval astrologer who makes a prophecy to the king that his wife is going to die very shortly. And he tells it over to the king, and lo and behold, not long later, the king's wife passes away. And the king is furious because he assumes that it was the prophecy itself, it was the actual foretelling itself that killed the queen. And so the king is enraged, and the word spread that the king was enraged, and word got back to this astrologer. And he summoned the astrologer, the local prophet, into his chamber, into his palace, and had a plan to get back of the wrong that had been done to him. And he called him in and he said, "I'd like you to make a prophecy. When is it that you will die?" And so the prophet, he realizes that whenever he says, the king is actually going to kill him. So he freezes and he's nervous and he says, "I don't know." All of a sudden, he gets an idea. Nice Jewish guy. And he says, "King, Your Majesty, I don't know when it will be, but I know that when it happens, you'll die 3 days later." Oh. The belief in prophecy is one of the 13 principles of faith. When the Rambam, the medieval sage Maimonides, codifies the essential beliefs of Judaism, the belief in prophecy, that God communicates to mankind through prophets, is one of those essential pillars. The word Navi, the word for prophet in Hebrew, comes from the words Niv Safsaim, which means the fruit of the lips, that which is produced from the lips. What is a prophet? A prophet is someone who receives messages from God in order to transmit them to the people. Now what's contained in those messages? There's a lot of people who claim to be prophets. Go down to certain street corners and you'll see them with the sandwich signs, "The end is nigh." You go to the inner city of most large cities around the country, and you'll see people, "The end is nigh," all these prophets, all these self-proclaimed prophets. What is the message of a true prophet? It's not the purpose of existence. It's not to legislate new laws and tell people what they're meant to be doing, some nuanced thing. That's in the Torah. Laws and purpose are confined to the Torah. The prophet's goal, the reason that Hashem sends a prophet, is in order to make corrections in the direction of Jewish society or society at large. Sometimes it's to tell the future, in order to encourage us in our mission in life. Isaiah, Yeshaya, tells of the Messianic era, the culmination and reward of all of our efforts. Or the prophet comes to tell us where we're slacking off and what the dire consequences could be if we keep along this path. The prophet Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah, tells of the destruction of the Holy Temple, that if the Jewish people keep up their bad behavior, this is going to be the result. Jonah, he sent to Nineveh to warn the people that they would be destroyed unless they repent as well. Now, a prophet was not allowed to change anything that the Torah commanded. In fact, we'll learn a little bit later that if a prophet tries to do that, that's one of the key indicators that he's a false prophet. So a prophet was never allowed to permanently make a change to Jewish law. For example, if a prophet comes around, and says that the Sabbath, Shabbos, is no longer applicable. God changed his mind. Enough of that. This guy is not a prophet. If he says that tefillin are no longer meant to be worn, or that the laws of keeping kosher are no longer applicable, to cast him away. He's not a true prophet from God. Now, there was an exception in extenuating circumstances. A prophet was allowed to temporarily alleviate a commandment of the Torah. For example, we are told that the prophet Elijah, in order to prove the point that God was trying to instill in the people, was allowed to offer a sacrifice outside of the Holy Temple. Since when the temple was built, and from then on, sacrifices could only be offered from that place. They couldn't be offered just any old place that you choose. The prophet Elijah was allowed to temporarily suspend the law, but it can't be a complete abrogation of an established Torah law.
That was Mount Carmel?
Oh, yeah. Alan's been coming to classes.
I didn't read it.
Yeah. So how does one become a prophet? Ooh, choose me. First, you have to become worthy. That's tough. How does a person become worthy for prophecy? Or how did a person become worthy for prophecy? They had to be wise. They had to be of clear and lucid mind, of impeccable character, in full control of their evil inclination, of calm and joyous constitution. They have to shun materiality and the frivolities of life. They have to devote themselves entirely to knowing God and serving God. In fact, at certain points in Jewish history, there were prophecy schools in which a person would sort of join the school, and a person of these character traits would join the school and really just engage themselves full force in trying to attain the level of prophecy, meaning cultivating righteousness, cultivating learning, and prolonged meditation. These were ways of making a person a vessel to receive prophecy. So when these potential prophets were in the prophecy school, they would cultivate themselves to make themselves into a vessel that would be someone who's possibly capable of receiving prophecy. Now, ultimately, at the end of the day, this is something that was done by divine election. It wasn't something that if I sit 3 years in prophecy school, I'm a prophet. I graduate as a prophet, you turn your tassel and now you're a prophet and you can go warn the world of all the wonderful good things and terrible bad things that are coming. It didn't work like that. The prophecy schools were meant as sort of like a yeshiva environment that the people cultivated themselves into vessels to be able to receive prophecy. That doesn't mean that they were going to become a prophet. It just meant that you perhaps were capable of receiving prophecy. Ultimately, again, it was something by divine election. If God decided that you were the person through which the prophecy was going to come through, you would all of a sudden have prophecy. The prophecy experience was like an uncontrolled ESP. Prophecy would manifest itself without any warning signals. Now, how are prophets verified? Again, we see lots around the city. You see the end is nigh people with the sandwich signs and hear ye, and making a big tumult about all sorts of different things. How is a prophet verified? How do you know that someone is a prophet or not? So, first of all, they have to possess those attributes that we mentioned before: God-fearingness, learnedness, meditative qualities, shunning the evil inclination, etc. Then that person, if they announce that they received prophecy, it's assumed that they are telling the truth. Now, not just any old person, a person of that upright character who says that they've had prophecy. We assume that they are telling the truth, and then it comes to a test to see if the actual prophecy that they declare comes out into fruition. Now, the accuracy of his prophecy were not counted with calamities. Meaning, if the prophet says, I've received a prophecy, and he tells of some calamity that's going to happen next week, and it doesn't come to be, we don't necessarily, cut him off and say he's not a true prophet, because with negative prophecies, there's always the chance that the Jewish people, or people at large, are going to do teshuvah, that they're going to repent, amend their ways, and that God's going to rescind that possible scenario that was going to come about. So if he prophesies something that good is going to happen, though, and it doesn't come about, then we know that this guy is a false prophet. Now, the character of the actual prophecy itself, there were two criteria that went into it. It had to be specific and non-predictable to be a viable prophecy. Meaning, if you're sitting around in the summer in Florida and you say, the Lord hath told me 5 inches of rain tomorrow, you're not a prophet. I don't care if there's exactly 5 inches of rain. Sorry, Charlie, not a prophet. Just the way it works. Again, it has to be something very specific and non-predictable. So if you're sitting in the Florida summer and you say it's going to snow 10 inches of snow tomorrow, and there was no weather indicators of that, meteorologists didn't, then you might have something going for you. But it has to be very specific and non-predictable. So that's one way, by the way, that we can sort of write off some of these prophet cases that sometimes you hear about on the History Channel or learning channels and whatnot. They do documentaries on people like Nostradamus, for example. Nostradamus is very popular, like a prophet figure, and if you look through his prophetic works, the prophecies that he gives are, first of all, vague, and second of all, we don't realize that they're even prophecies until there's like a vague semblance of it comes out hundreds of years later. So prophecies of like the great king will come from the north, or the great eagle will swoop from the west, sounds nice, sounds poetic, and it makes for some good email chains after a big thing happens. But as far as prophecy is concerned, we have to write that off. In the Torah, it's interesting that there are certain prophecies that are foretold of the Jewish people as a whole. The Torah tells us some prophecies that really aren't very good, isn't very good news, but things that have unfortunately come true to the T in our own lives and throughout our history. The Torah tells us as a prophecy that to the Jewish people, I will scatter you amongst the nations. I will unsheath the sword after you, leaving your country desolate and your cities in ruins. This is prophesizing that Israel will be destroyed, the Jewish people will be dispersed, even before they even entered into it. Now, this prophecy of the Jews being expelled around the world becomes a little bit even more sort of hard to fulfill, because exile was kind of rare in the ancient world. Rulers, when they would come in and they would conquer a land, exiling the people who were there wasn't usually the preferred mode of how to work with these people. Usually you tax the population, you subjugate the population, you work them, but not necessarily to exile them. So that was kind of an interesting thing to have foretold in the ancient world. Also, some prophecies, in addition to that the Jewish people are told are going to happen to them, make the whole cholent of prophecies harder to come to fruition. For example, the Jews are told also that they're going to be an eternal nation. So that makes the prophecy of being scattered amongst the nations even harder to have that fulfilled. Because scattered amongst the nations, okay, you'll be scattered amongst the nations, then you'll assimilate and no one will ever hear from you again. But not only that, but you'll be scattered amongst the nations, and by the way, you'll also be an eternal people. Wow, that makes that a really specific and hard to fulfill prophecy. In addition, the eternal nationhood is even more unlikely, right? Like we said, considering the above, considering the exile that we talked about earlier. The Jews are also told that they'll always remain small in number, and they will always be unpopular in our host countries. Now, what is it like to experience prophecy? If you were a prophet, what would that be like to experience it? It's like an overload of the mental equipment on the receiver. Could you imagine like a high megawatt signal to a low wattage instrument? You have a little light bulb, and you pull the full intensity of FPL, right? All the electricity flowing through that light bulb just explodes. It was a complete overload of the mental capacity. Prophecy frequently caused fainting, temporary insanity, involuntary muscle spasms, and seizures. So it was a complete overload of the system for the prophet who was receiving prophecy. Some prophets received signals in their sleep. They had extremely enigmatic dreams that they would decode when they would wake up. There were no verbal or mental conversations with God as depicted in Hollywood. It wasn't like you had some bearded shepherd walking through the meadow, and all of a sudden, like it is in Hollywood, the Lord calls and, Abraham, right? And then there's an instruction. It didn't work like that. Prophecy to the prophets was done in this way, either through the dreamlike state, and certainly through this over-processing state where there was too much information, too much meaning to be conveyed through the vessel of the human mind. The only exception to this rule is Moses. Moshe, it says that he talked to God like a man talking to his friend. So his prophecy is of a completely different caliber than the other prophets that are mentioned after him. So Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Isaiah, they received their prophecy in either the dreamlike state or in these wild fits in which they were trying to process the information. Now, who were the prophets? There were thousands of prophets in Jewish history. Literally thousands. Most of them were specific to circumstances that they were sent for, that were confined to that specific time and that specific place. And therefore, most of their prophecies are not recorded for posterity. The only prophecies that are recorded in our Bible are those that have eternal meaning and significance to the Jewish people worldwide at all times. So there were thousands of prophets that foretold of different events and whatnot, but again, it was only relegated to that specific time and place that information was needed and necessary. Many of these thousands of prophets were ordinary citizens, students, craftsmen, farmers, who by virtue of their heightened sensitivity to spirituality were selected by God to receive prophecy. The Talmud counts 55 prophets in Tanakh, 55 in the Bible, meaning that those prophecies will be ones that will be eternal for all generations, always relevant. In fact, in the Bible text, women are not excluded from this. Women were also prophets as well. Sarah, Miriam, Devorah, Hannah, Abigail, Esther. These are names of women who were prophets as well. Now, does prophecy exist today? $1 million question, right? Look for a prophet. Everybody's looking for a prophet, right? So does prophecy exist today? Officially, prophecy ended 23 centuries ago, in the first generation of the Second Holy Temple. So 2,300 years ago, approximately 350 BCE. And we'll talk about why that is as the night continues. So prophecy, the official status of prophecy ended many, many centuries ago, 23 centuries ago. God always keeps a parallel of divine influence in the world. Meaning whenever we find goodness in the world, we find the equal of negativity in the world. Whenever we find challenge in the world, we find on the opposite of the end a power to overcome that challenge among us. So this sort of parallel force of good and bad, good and negative, are to they're there in order to preserve our free will. In other words, if there was such an overload of positive capabilities that a person had, then they would never choose to do the wrong thing. And if the inclination to do the wrong thing was overpowering, right, they would never have the inclination to overcome it. They'd never have the ability to overcome it and do the right thing. So as much as a person has a desire towards negativity, they're granted the same desire, equal and opposite desire towards positivity. And that exists both within the person and within the world at large. You'll notice something very interesting throughout the Bible text. You'll see that so many times the Jewish people get caught up in idolatry, worshiping idols, bowing to statues and whatnot. You think to yourself, were these people so stupid? The Jewish people, over and over and over again, it's like they worship an idol, God sends a prophet, change your ways, or bad stuff's going to happen. They change their ways, they repent, right? And then not too long later, they're back to idolatry. So we find time and again these Jews getting caught up in idolatry. Well, the reason for that is that in the world, if there is extra spiritual sensitivity granted, there's extra spiritual challenge granted as well. So meaning if prophecy is something that is available in the world, this very, very heightened state of awareness and divine connection is a possibility that a person can achieve, so also their inclination towards serving the opposite is also present. So it says that prophecy ended promptly when the desire for idolatry ended. Meaning God removed both of those drives and abilities from the world at the same time. So because back then there was this extra challenge, the people were granted on the opposite end of the spectrum this extra ability of prophecy. When one ended, both had to come to an end. Now, in Judaism, by the way, we believe in sort of like a spiritual devolution. Right? Spiritual devolution means that when you start with Adam, the first human being, and you start with the generation that experienced Mount Sinai, the Sinai experience, God giving the Torah, that was the peak of the spiritual accomplishment, the pinnacle of spiritual achievement. Everything after that is one generation more removed from that spiritual experience. And so spiritually speaking, there's sort of like a devolution that has been going on since the beginning of time. Now, it's not hard to imagine. It's kind of like when you take a piece of paper and you put it in the copy machine, and then you make a copy. And you take the copy and you make a copy of that copy. And then you take the copy that you just made, stick it back in and make another copy. When you get 20 or 30 or 40 times doing that, the copy that you have is very, very different than the original copy, the original document that you were using. It's much less clear, whatever. So devolution, spiritual devolution, has been going on generationally since the beginning. The Talmud says something very interesting about that. The Gemara in Shabbos says that if the earlier generations were like angels, then we are like people. And if they were like people, then we are like donkeys, spiritually speaking. There's a story that's told, it's a true story, about a rabbi who was sitting on an airplane. with his grandchild, and next to him was a non-Jewish man, a grandfather as well, with his grandchild at his side. Now, the rabbi's grandson was sitting next to him on the airplane, well-behaved, acting like a perfect gentleman, and his neighbor, the grandchild, was walking up and down, talking back, being rude, being wild. And so the grandfather looks over at the other grandfather and says, "How do you do it? Your grandchild's so well behaved. How is it that you keep him under? He's such a good boy." And so the Jewish rabbi, the grandfather, says, the answer is very simple. You teach your children that you evolved from monkeys. He's 2 generations more evolved than you. Why should he care about you, and why should he listen to you? He's a more evolved creature. We teach, the Torah teaches, that we came from Adam, and we came from the generation of the giving of the Torah. And every generation since then is a little bit less connected than the generation that preceded it. So I'm 2 generations more connected with the source. I'm 2 generations more pure. Of course he's going to have reverence towards me. So that just highlights the point that there's a sort of spiritual devolution that takes place throughout the course of human history. So back in the day, prophecy was a thing. There were many prophets, and prophecy was something that was achievable. After that point, there was less divine intuition that a person was capable of tapping into. Now, there is divine intuition that is available today, but it's a lesser degree than prophecy was. And as the generations continue, the level of divine intuition slowly decreases. So meaning, even 2,000 years ago in Talmudic times, prophecy had ended, but the divine intuition, the Ruach HaKodesh that they were able to achieve, was much greater than the Ruach HaKodesh, the divine intuition in which we today are able to achieve. Ruach HaKodesh today, by the way, divine intuition, is also achieved through righteousness and meditation techniques. Study and meditation, what they do is they grant one pantoscopic vision, the ability to blur the senses, an extrasensory perception of sorts, and allow a person to visualize more than the 3 dimensions of reality that are in front of their eyes. Now again, this comes with extreme righteousness and extreme care in following, keeping Torah and mitzvahs. So it's not just, I feel like I get divine intuition sometimes. Maybe a guest who's going to call on the phone or whatnot. But the true divine intuition that we're talking about here is something that comes with piety and a strong commitment to Torah observance. Now again, it's something that anyone is able to achieve, but those are the prerequisites. Not so easy. Let's talk about a very famous prophecy. As soon as I told someone this week that we were going to do the topic of prophecy, they said, can we talk about the prophecy of Mashiach or false prophets that have come to the Jewish people? So I just want to touch on that while we're talking about prophecy and prophets. So Mashiach himself, Messiah himself, is going to be a prophet. The Messianic era is a prophecy that is talked about in the Jewish Bible, and it will become a universal phenomenon. The Rambam, the famed medieval sage Maimonides, says in his letters to the Jews of Yemen that prophecy will return to the Jewish people shortly before Mashiach comes. So it's something that, prophecy again, is something that for many years has not been available, but right before Mashiach comes, prophecy, that strong level of divine attachment and revelation, will once again be available. And certainly when Mashiach comes, prophecy will be reinstated. So let's talk about some of the prophecies that are foretold about Mashiach coming. Number one, that he will restore the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, that the exiles, the Jewish people all over the world, will be gathered into Israel. It'll be an end to evil and to wrongdoings. There'll be an awareness and a knowledge of God in the world, a universal worship of God. There'll be universal peace and harmony, a resurrection of the dead, a blissful utopia, an end to disease and death. Sounds great to me. And all of these specific prophecies were foretold by our prophets in the Bible. Now, this person of Mashiach, who is he? He's a human being, descendant of King David through his son Solomon. He's going to be someone who will be fully observant of mitzvahs, and he will compel the Jewish people of his generation to do the same. And in fact, every generation has one person, at least, who is capable of being Mashiach. In other words, if that time is right, that person will sort of inherit the soul of Mashiach that has been waiting in the divine treasure stores, and that person will indeed be the actual Mashiach. Now, the Jewish people have had their share of false prophets and false messiahs throughout our history. We have to remember one thing. Miracles do not make someone a prophet. Miracles also do not make someone Mashiach. Either way. So if a person says, look at this guy, he's a miracle worker. Right? You always hear about some guru or whatnot that can levitate or do all sorts of fun tricks and miracles. Those, no matter how many they do, no matter what the caliber is, okay, that does not make a prophet, and that does not make a Messiah. Otherwise, David Copperfield, might as well crown him now. Statue of Liberty disappearing, I mean, that's pretty good. So no tricks, no gimmicks, no nothing in that realm, no miracles or whatnot, make someone a prophet or make someone a Messiah. Prophets and prophecy come from what we discussed earlier, of a certain spiritual caliber, and making a prophecy that is specific and not predictable, that comes true. And the Messiah is, again, can only be a descendant of King David through his son Solomon, someone who's completely observant in Torah and mitzvahs and encourages their generation to do the same. Now, the Torah tells us, it warns us that there could be a false prophet or a false Messiah. And this is actually the tool that the Torah tells us. How do you identify this person who comes to you with a sign and tells you, God has spoken to me? And then he even gives you a sign or a wonder, whatever that sign or wonder is. So the Torah tells us, if what he tells you goes against Torah and mitzvahs, meaning he comes and he annuls a mitzvah, you know that this guy is full of it. That's basically almost exactly what the Torah says. Basically, execute that man, you know that he's a test and not the real deal. So he comes and he does these wonders, and all this fanfare and whatnot is created around them. It doesn't matter. Miracles mean nothing in the sense of who's a prophet and who's Messiah. Because there's a lot of characters who can do a lot of interesting tricks, but a Messiah nor a prophet does it make. So usually the question that follows this is, how come not JC? Why not him? Well, first of all, miracles doth a Messiah not make. That was my King James style.
What was it?
Miracles doth a Messiah not make. So, first of all, he fulfilled none of the prophecies of Mashiach's coming. Instead, he actually, in some ways, caused the opposite. He was not a prophet. Prophecy only exists when the Holy Land is inhabited by a majority of world Jewry. And at the time of Ezra, which was 300 BCE, the majority of the Jews refused to move from Babylon to Israel. And so prophecy ended up with the death of the last prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. So JC was approximately 350 years after prophecy ended. So he wasn't a prophet, that's for sure. Secondly, he's not a descendant of King David on his father's side, right? He had no human father, right? That's what they say. And this is not a quality that also can pass through adoption. So even if you want to trace it through Joseph, who was sort of like, adopted father, surrogate father figure, this messianic genealogy does not pass through adoption. Okay? And even if it could, even if you wanted to say that Joseph could somehow bequeath his genealogy to his adopted surrogate son, one of the people that is listed in the genealogy of Joseph in the book of Matthew is that Joseph is a descendant of Jeconiah, who it says in the book of Jeremiah, Yirmiyahu, that none of his descendants will ever sit on the throne of David. Furthermore, in the Gospels, there are instances where he breaks the Torah. He breaks commandments. And he says the commandments are unapplicable. In the book of John, the book of Acts, the book of John says that he made paste, which was in violation of Shabbos, in violation of the Sabbath, which caused the Pharisees, it says over there, to say that he doesn't observe the Shabbos, he doesn't observe the Sabbath. His main, quote-unquote, prophecy fulfillments come from either mistranslations or other sort of things that are making it fit. In other words, things like the virgin birth or the crucifixion or the suffering servant of Isaiah are all things that were never messianic prophecies. But then when that was in the story, they sort of like backtracked it and made this thing. Oh, well, he's a fulfillment of the prophecy. Well, that was never a prophecy. The Messiah was never even meant to do those things. It's sort of like, they tell a great analogy. Analogy is that this man is walking through a forest and he sees a bullseye on a tree, and there's a arrow right through the bullseye of this target. And he says, "Wow, whoever the archer was, a very good archer." And he walks a little bit further in the forest and he sees another target painted on a tree with an arrow directly through the bullseye. And he says, "Wow, this is incredible." And he keeps finding the same phenomenon as he continues walking through the forest. And finally he gets to a clearing where he actually sees the archer. And he runs over to the archer and he says, "You're the most impressive archer I've ever seen in my life. How in the world did you become so skilled?" And so the archer says, "It's very simple. I shoot my arrow, it lands in the tree, and then I draw a target around it." So it's a cute story. It's a kind of funny story, but it's a real analogy of sort of what took place. That you had these quote-unquote prophecies, which never were prophecies, and then you look back into what they call the Old Testament, find what they can construe as things that are foretelling of what took place, and then all of a sudden it looks like, look, here's the old, it says this is going to happen, here's the new, it says he did it, fulfillment of prophecy, he's the man. Meanwhile, those things were never things that he was meant to do anyway. There's a very interesting thing that was written about during the Second World War. It was published in many newspapers around the country and other publications as well. There were a lot of people who thought, based on their own calculations and whatnot, that the Second World War, I'm talking about the world at large, the Second World War was going to be, following it or during it, was going to be the second coming. The second coming was now. And it was interesting that sort of the stipulation that they came up with was that if you take a look at all of the major world leaders during the Second World War, it alludes to something very interesting. Right? Who's the leader of Britain? Churchill, C. Who's the leader of Germany? Hitler, H. Who's the leader of the United States? R. Roosevelt, R. Who's the leader of Italy? Mussolini, also known as Il Duce, right? I. Right? Who's the leader of Soviet Russia? Stalin. S. Who's the main general of Japan? General Tojo. C. H. R. I. S. T. It's kind of spooky, right? Right? And that's what certain people published in newspapers and whatnot. However, that wouldn't fly as a Jewish prophecy. Why? Because you can't just make stuff fit. In other words, why use Il Duce instead of Mussolini, his real name? You didn't do that with any of the other people. If you're going to do that with Mussolini, then instead of Hitler, say he's Der Führer. Right? That's what he was called. So if you're going to do it in one, you got to do it in the other. Also, General Tojo is the general. Right? Why not use the Emperor of Japan? Or why not use the King of England? Why use Churchill? Why not use King George? So, at first glance, it sounds spooky, eerie, like, wow. And how come limiting it to those few countries? There were other countries on both the Allied and the Axis powers. So why limit? Because that makes it fit. And it sounds really good to do it that way. So those are some of the reasons why it would not apply to the founder of Christianity. He was not a prophet. And in fact, the prophecies about Messiah actually coming, not only did he not bring them, but in some ways he brought the opposite. What are the main prophecies of Mashiach coming? We said that he'll rebuild the temple, ingather the exile, and create a world of world peace, a time of world peace. Since he has passed, the temple was destroyed. The Jews were exiled from their land. It's the exact opposite. And I'm not saying that this is what he necessarily, this is what he wanted, but certainly you can make the case that nothing more opposite of world peace has ever been done in somebody's name than in this individual. Again, I'm not saying that's what he wanted or that's what his intent was, but the proof is in the pudding. What happened at the end of the day was not world peace. So all of the main prophecies, the real prophecies, the essentials, were not only not fulfilled, but the opposite was done. So it wouldn't work over there. There are some interesting prophecies. I want to mention one that's discussed, that's mentioned by the Medrash Rabbah, quoting earlier sources, that says that the Western Wall will never be destroyed. Isn't that kind of wacky? Why? How? It says very clearly that the Western Wall won't be destroyed. Go visit it today. You'd think after so many times the land of Israel being conquered and built up upon again and then conquered again, and then you'd think that still there. So what's the practical relevance to us? There's no prophecy today. There is divine intuition. In fact, in Pirkei Avos, the ethics of our fathers, it teaches that every single day, there's a voice that issues forth from Mount Sinai proclaiming, "Woe to them, to the people, for their insult to the Torah." Meaning, there is a voice that is proclaimed every single day from Mount Sinai to repent, to make yourself better, to make amends, to get in the right. Now you think to yourself, what's the point if I can't hear it? Right? Think to yourself. I've never heard it before. Maybe some of you have. If you have, but what's the point? What would be the point if I haven't heard it? So the Baal Shem Tov explains that this pronouncement is to be found in the realm of thought. That although we don't hear it with our ears, it influences our mind. It's like a subliminal message that's sort of implanted within us. Our physical ears don't hear, but our mind hears and our heart hears. And that's why there's no wicked person, says the Baal Shem Tov, a wicked person that doesn't have at least some murmurings of repentance by virtue of hearing this pronouncement in their thoughts. So also says, therefore, when a person wakes somewhat from their spiritual slumber, the heavenly voice becomes audible in the heart. It's kind of like, you ever in a place that's very noisy, and you're like talking really loud to your neighbor, right? And it seems to get swallowed up in the loud noise that's going on. So there's a lot of noise going on, and you're like screaming to the person next to you, to I'm over here, or telling them directions. You turn right, and all of a sudden everybody stops. Everyone stops talking. You're like screaming. That ever happen to you? No. I'm the only one? All right. I know it's happened to you. So you're talking loud, but not until everybody else stops, until you calm the outside noise. The person, you have to scream. That scream is like swallowed up in the outside noise. So there's a scream from Mount Sinai every single day. Make yourself better.
Silent scream.
The Sinai scream. Right, good, Alan.
Silent.
Right. The silent Sinai scream. Right? And every single day it is a scream. And it is audible. However, in our minds and in our hearts, there is so much static noise as well. It's like we're in that crowded room, no matter how loud the voice is. And it's loud. The person is screaming at the top of their lungs, but they can't hear you. The neighbor can't hear because there's so much other static noise in the room. Only when you quiet the other static noise can you perceive what the person next to you is trying to convey. So it works the same way with us. In our life, every day there is a divine message telling us, be a little bit better. You can do it. Be a little bit better tomorrow than you were today. It's a divine intuition implanted in us, bequeathed to us. But we have a lot of other static in our life and in our minds. And so if we train ourselves through being a little bit better, righteousness, mitzvah observance, if we quiet the outside noise, we might just be able to hear a little bit of that divine call every single day. This week, remember to yourself that each one of you are a walking, breathing, and living fulfillment of a most unprecedented prophecy. You are Jews. You are part of this eternal nation that will always be small and always be present. Each one of you is the fulfillment of a Torah prophecy. Don't just exist with that. Let's live with that. Let's embody it. And this week, enhance your Jewish connection a little bit. And by doing so, each one of us getting a little bit more connected with our Jewish self, we usher in the future prophecies of the world of good and the world of peace. Have a wonderful night.
Click subscribe to see more exclusive content for the most sought-after Jewish speakers, teachers, and thinkers.